SBC Media.
Welcome to the iGaming Daily Podcast, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market.
This morning, the Gambling Commission published its young people and gambling statistics. Datasets are indexed against studies conducted in 2023 and 2022 to provide insights in young people's exposure and experience of gambling. Headline cites that 27% of young people have actively engaged in gambling in the past 12 months prior to the study. But breaking through the noise, iGaming Daily today breaks down the report with Regulus Partners Dan Waugh. iGaming Daily is brought to you by Optimove, the #1 marketing and CRM solutions for the global iGaming market. I'm Ted Menmuir, and joining me today we have Dan Waugh, partner at Regulus, and Steve Hoare, editor of SBC's Player Protection Hub. So let me bring it over to you guys. Your first take on this report and what it kind of brings to light.
A lot of the results are fairly unexpected. The rates of participation by children in gambling remain pretty low. Certainly when you're looking at their participation in age-restricted forms of gambling, it's about 6% on a past year basis, which is relatively low. It is up a bit compared with last year. I suspect that what will grab the headlines when people sort of wake up to this, and perhaps when people get over the US election and start focusing on this, is that the rate of problem gambling has gone up from 0.7% of children last year to 1.5% of school children this year. That is, however, within the sort of recent range of estimates. So it's sort of fairly similar with what we were seeing between 2018 and 2020.
It sounds like a big rise though, doesn't it, Dan?
Yeah, it does. But there's probably a few things that are worth saying about this. First of all, there's about 3,800 children in the survey. So what you're looking at is that rise is about 35 children in the survey term. So you are extrapolating up from a relatively small survey sample to try to get to a population estimate. The second thing is, and I think this is often misunderstood when people look at this particular survey, is that the measure of problem gambling that is used in the survey is not the same that's used in the adult surveys. So it uses a specially adjusted screening instrument called the DSM-4 MRJ, and this uses much, much lower, softer thresholds for assessing problematic gambling. And we can see that in comparisons between the adult survey and the children's survey. So in the adult survey, the least endorsed item on the DSM is committing a crime because of your gambling. It is the most endorsed item in the children's survey. Now, why is that? Have we got loads of children running around, raiding corner shops in order to get money to go and gamble? No, it's because in the young people survey, committing a crime is classified as the use of any money that's not given to them specifically for the purpose of gambling. So if they use their pocket money, their lunch money, their bus fare to gamble, then that is considered committing a crime. So that's an example of how much softer the thresholds are in the children's survey versus the adult survey. And I think this is relevant when you start to look at what children in the survey actually say they're gambling on, because very few of them are saying they gamble on age-restricted gambling products. The most commonly endorsed items are having private bets with their friends or family, and also playing cards with their friends or family. So these are the most common activities they do. So if you go to school and you play cards with your mates, or you have a bet with your mates at school, and you do that using your pocket money or bus fare, and this is something I used to do, I suspect that quite a lot of other people used to do this is not a new thing, then you would be classified as committing a crime in order to gamble using the junior screen of the problem gambling. And so it's actually relatively easy to get a problem gambling classification using this junior screen, far easier than it would be using an adult screen. And it's perhaps for that reason that when we actually look at the relationship between what activities people are doing and the problem gambling rate, it's actually very different to what we see in adult surveys. So the highest rates of problem gambling are seen actually in lottery products. So they're not observed in relation to things like online gambling. The vast majority of children who are classified as problem gamblers in these surveys do not gamble online and not maybe possibly not even gambling on anything that's age restricted. So you can play lotteries or you can play cards with your friends, and that can classify you as a problem gambler in this survey.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out, isn't it, that 27% of children who gamble in this survey, I think 20% of them are playing in arcades on, penny pushers and things like that. Which
these are crane grab machines, yeah. So you're putting in £1 trying to win a fluffy, cuddly toy.
And if they're using their pocket money to do so, they might have a problem gambling issue.
Well,
unless their pocket money's been given to them specifically for that purpose.
Yeah, and I would argue actually that if you have a child that's being given money specifically by their parents in order to gamble, that's probably more concerning than the fact their parents are encouraging them to do so. That would be slightly more concerning. So it's not to say that there aren't children who experience adverse consequences, but it's important to recognise that we're not talking about the same thing as we are talking about when we're talking about adults with problem gambling. And we can actually see this when we compare with the health surveys. So the health surveys, the last 4 editions, I believe, we see 0% problem gambling for 16 and 17-year-olds. 0%. So the idea that, you've got lots of children who are problem gamblers at the age of 11, and then at 16 it disappears is not plausible. So it's just the fact we're looking at different things here.
To be fair, I don't think the Gambling Commission has kind of hyped up any of its findings at all, has it? It's presented them very straight and...
Yes, and I think that's been a definite improvement. I mean, there was one, this is going back a few years, but in a previous year when the survey was released, I think it was given as an exclusive to the Daily Mail, and there was a quote in there from somebody at the Commission saying, we ought to be concerned about turning playgrounds into casinos or something like that. It was something sort of tried to whip it up a bit, tried to whip up concern about this. They've definitely been far more sober in their reporting of this. I think if there's a slight criticism of the Gambling Commission's handling of this is that it's pushed out this survey. It has made some efforts to make sure that it's reported responsibly, but it hasn't really proactively pursued that. And we have seen in previous years, I mean, so far, what I've seen this morning, there's not been a lot of pickup on this year's survey, despite what we're seeing as an increase in the reported rate of problem gambling. But in previous years, we have seen a lot of hysteria around this. And commonly, it's been alleged that, you've got these children who are problem gamblers or often misleadingly described as addicts. And the online gambling industry generally gets the blame for this. And then when you dig into it, you say, well, actually, that's not really that plausible. You've got to be careful about sort of looking at correlations and assuming that you can derive some sort of causality there. But if anything is a matter of concern that coming out of these survey statistics that we look at, it sort of indicates the bigger issue might actually be lottery play, national lottery play. And we put them a Freedom of Information Act a couple of years ago to ask what discussions the Gambling Commission had about national lottery play and underage gambling and potentially underage problem gambling. And they said none, which is sort of astonishing. So it either means they're not digging into this in the way that we did, or that they're sort of saying, well, actually, it's perhaps better if we don't look at that.
Okay, so I'm going to take this to Steve and you, Dan, with your analyst hat, and Steve with your editor's hat. How happy are you kind of on the boundaries of the research and the definitions of the research and what it implies in terms of exposure and experience? And what are kind of the triggers for youth gambling? Steve, I'll take it to you.
Yeah, well, there was one of the things there that Dan touched on when he mentioned, if parents were giving their children money to gamble, that would be very concerning. But that does touch on the issue of exposure. And while that was said in jest, I think that's one of the things that comes out of the survey that is potentially interesting, is the influence of the influence of family on children. Who'd have thought it? But still, as with all these things, these are worth noting, but I don't think there's a lot to be alarmed about here.
Yeah, I mean, again, we come back to what is the thing we're concerned about here? Are we concerned about children gambling? Should children not be allowed to gamble? Well, that's not what the law says. The law actually does allow children to play pusher machines in seaside arcades. Until relatively recently, 16-year-olds were allowed to buy lottery tickets. So there is provision, and also there's no law banning children from having bets with each other. There's no law banning children from playing cards with their family for money. And it would be quite concerning if the law did ban those things, I would suggest, because that takes the state into people's homes. But interestingly enough, there have been, people like politicians like Ian Duncan Smith and co have fulminated about this survey in the past and said, the state needs to do something. Well, if you're genuinely concerned about children gambling and this sort of 27% figure that Steve mentioned, well, does the state start going into people's homes, start prosecuting adults for letting their children play cards? I mean, that would be quite concerning here. So I think on the exposure point, we see an increase in this year's survey in terms of children saying they've seen gambling adverts. It is an increase on last year, but it's sort of broadly similar with where we were the previous year. So I think we've always got to be slightly careful in these surveys because you're dealing with relatively small samples. It's 3,000 to 4,000 in each year. So it doesn't take a lot to change, to trigger what look like meaningful increases. Which is also a good reason why if numbers shift down, and we had seen problem gambling rates shift downwards in 2 successive years, it's a danger if the gambling industry is too triumphal about that, because you will inevitably revert to the mean on these things, I think. There's some other questions in there about whether gambling, seeing an advert has ever prompted the child to gamble. And I think in this latest survey, it's about 5% of the school children survey said they'd gambled as a result of seeing an advert. Now, that, again, sounds like it's something that could be dreadfully alarming, but we're not told what advert they've seen, and we're not told what they've then gambled on. And if you look into the data, which we have access to a far more detailed data set for 2020, and when we look at that, we're able to see that, yes, there's a relationship, children saying they've been prompted to gamble, but hardly any of them were gambling on age-restricted activities. So it could be you see, and I'm not saying this is not necessarily a problem, but you could see an advert for a sports betting site, and then as a consequence of seeing that, or at least that's how you explain it, you then have a bet with your friend on the outcome of a football match. Now, that might be concerning, but it's not as though it's not the same impression I think some people derive, is that children are seeing gambling adverts and then going and gambling on regulated gambling sites. We know that's not true. We know that's not actually possible unless it's facilitated by a parent. And again, that's something we've seen in previous surveys where children are gambling underage, where they're gambling on age-restricted activities. It is almost always with the connivance of an adult, whether that's a parent or guardian, older sibling, or some other adult.
SBC Leaders connects the gambling industry's top-tier operators and associations to share the best ideas, collaborate on solving the biggest issues, and push innovation throughout the betting and gaming industry. If you're an operator and want to join the discussion, visit sbcleaders.com for more information.
Yeah, because it's definitely a report that kind of you need to break down the activities, and also you need to kind of understand the environments of where the gambling's taking place and what they're gambling on. You as adults, what are your kind of concerns? What are kind of the exposures of children gambling, and what are the actual dangers that are presented in the report?
I think, if you look into the report, you'll find if children are engaged in gambling, particularly if they're gambling underage, either they're gambling on age-restricted activities, that's naturally a source of concern because these are age-restricted activities for a reason. So children shouldn't be doing it. Thankfully, relatively few children actually report doing this. If they are doing this, then it might mean that it might be a precursor to harm in subsequent years. It could also indicate that their home life is not very good. It could indicate that their pursuit of academic studies is not very good. So it can indicate there is a risk there that this has negative impacts on the child's development and the child's well-being.
There was a notable if in your sentence there, Dan, because I guess there is the question of children boasting when answering these sorts of surveys. It's like, yeah, I went down to the bookies and placed a bet. Honest, Gov.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because in a different context, we've written quite a lot about the new gambling survey for Great Britain, and it has been claimed by some of the people close to that project that health surveys have underreported problem gambling because of what we call socially desirable response bias, which is people not willing to say what they actually do. And therefore, the claim is that problem gambling rates in the adult survey have been underreported because people have not answered these questions candidly. Now, actually, when we looked at the young people on gambling survey a couple of years ago, we found sort of indications that the opposite was true in the young people survey. And I'll give you an example of this. We found that about 20% of those children classified as problem gamblers reported gambling on every single gambling item in the survey. So the survey contains, I think, 16 possible gambling activities, including placing a bet in a betting shop, playing on a machine in a betting shop, online sports betting, online gaming, playing table games in a physical casino, playing bingo, etc. Now, 20% of these problem gamblers said they'd done every single one of those activities in the previous year. Okay? Now, it's possible, I think it's somewhat unlikely. We then looked at how many said they'd done all of these 16 activities in the previous week. And 2/3 of that 20%, so about 13% of these problem gamblers said they had done all of these things in the week prior to being surveyed. Now, that is, I would put it that is a level of engagement that even people like Ian Duncan Smith might hopefully consider to be implausible. Yeah. So I think we have to be careful about how we review these results. Surveys are always going to be impacted by recall biases and other things. But I remember, from my days as a kid, which was in the last century, but kids don't always tell the truth. And there may be bravado, there may be other things, but in certain survey years, we found that the reported rate of participation in casino gambling in a casino for 11-year-olds was higher than it was for 40-year-olds. The idea that you can go into a casino and find 11-year-olds sat at the blackjack table is, outside of Pinocchio, that is just not realistic at all. So we have to be very careful about how we select these, how we describe these results, and really play the sort of be healthily skeptical. If something sounds implausible, if 2% of 11-year-olds in this country are sitting down at a blackjack table in casinos, does that sound realistic? And if it doesn't, we really should approach these survey results with a pinch of salt.
Okay, so we live at a time of polls and surveys. That's reflecting back on the US election. Dan, what do you believe in terms of surveys and how they're published and how they're taken to the media? And what is the responsibility of the Gambling Commission in that activity or in that segment to ensure that everything's fair play?
Yeah, I think surveys obviously have a role to play. They're not a substitute necessarily for hard data on what people actually do. There are all sorts of issues, as I said, with surveys in terms of recall bias, socially desirable response bias, selection bias, all these things. And I think what we would say is that, no survey tells the truth. It can only ever tell you about what some people say about what they do. And it cannot always be assumed to be representative of the population. So therefore, I think we've got to apply some healthy skepticism to what surveys tell us, but also really rely on those which have the strongest methodology. So if we take the health survey for England, for example, which has been described as the gold standard of surveys in this country, that is based upon relatively large sample, typically 8,000 adults. It is sampled on a random probability basis, and it gets a relatively high response rate. So if you're asked to take part in the health survey for England, the default answer is yes, certainly prior to COVID. So 50-60% of people would say yes. So that means we've got reasonable comfort that this survey may be accurate because it's the default answer to participate. If we look at the new gambling survey for Great Britain, which is an online survey, the response rate there has been about 19%. So the default response when you're asked to take part in the gambling survey for Great Britain is, no, I'm not going to do this. So we can have far less confidence that it's going to be representative. I think there are other issues that come into play, and particularly I think with the gambling survey for Great Britain is what we call topic salience bias. So a survey about gambling will attract people who are interested in gambling, whether that's because they do it a lot or whether they have strong moral views about it. But in the same way that a survey about football would attract people who are interested in football, survey about crochet, it would attract people who like knitting, right? So we have this, and so I think when you look at the gambling survey for Great Britain, which is what the Gambling Commission is trying to use to replace the health survey, I think we should be healthily skeptical there because it's got a low response rate. Those people who do respond are unlikely to be representative of the overall population. They're more likely to be gamblers. They're more likely to be highly engaged gamblers. Therefore, they're more likely to have people who develop problems with gambling. And so the surveys won't tell you the truth. I think what the Gambling Commission has tried to sort of suggest with this new survey is that because no survey is perfect, its survey is as good as the health survey. And I think that's a very slanted viewing of the subject. There is no reason if we think, as the Gambling Commission seems to be trying to suggest, that that the health survey has underreported problem gambling, that is not an accurate survey. And that's really quite worrying because it pretty much means that most things the health survey measures are going to be wrong. So the implication is the NHS actually has no clue about the health of the nation, which I think is a deeply concerning thing. I think it's actually quite irresponsible for the Gambling Commission to be suggesting that.
And look, where does the publishing of like this type of survey every year lead to? Because do we then have to view child gambling as a new area or a new critical area of gambling? And will it then lead to kind of more specific restrictions, more specific government prohibitions? And aren't the kids okay? I mean, aren't we protecting them already with the laws that we have?
So I think the survey serves a valid purpose. I think it's. I mean, it was brought in originally on the back of the National Lottery because it was originally run by Oflot to begin with, because there was some concern that allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to gamble might cause problems. So that's where it originates from. It is an important and valid area of inquiry to say actually to what extent are children gambling, to what extent are children experiencing harms from gambling. But we have to be we have to be healthily skeptical about what it actually shows us. But also, you then look at how it's used. To be fair to the Gambling Commission, they've not really found much objectionable in the past, and I suppose that's particularly because if you look at where this starts in 2011, the current time series, in 2011, 23% of children said they gambled on a pass-a-week basis. That's fallen to 7%, and that's been a fairly steady decline. It's sort of notched up a bit between last year and this year. But what we have seen, if you believe the Young People in Gambling Survey, it does indicate that as a nation, we've been relatively good at preventing underage gambling. So the underage gambling was 6% on a past year basis this year. It was 4% the year before. Where it's happening, it's because adults are facilitating it. So I think we can be reasonably happy that the survey shows that the Commission, the government, the operators, the whole sort of ecosystem, the regulatory environment is doing a relatively good job. I think one thing that is interesting is that, the consistent finding has been that where underage gambling is taking place, it's because adults are facilitating it. That hasn't really seen a response. And I'm not suggesting that, the state should adopt coercive powers there. But I do think more could be done, particularly by operators, to discourage their customers from sharing online their online gambling accounts. I think more could be done to discourage adults from letting their children gamble on age-restricted activities. We have seen operators in other jurisdictions, and the British Columbia Lottery Corporation is probably the best example, They have over a number of years really sort of gone out of their way to suggest to their customers, look, you really shouldn't let your children gamble if it's age restricted. So I think that's one bit where I think, the survey data has been fairly consistent here. It's telling us the same thing every year, and yet nobody's really doing anything about this. I think that is somewhere where that something could be done. Beyond that, I mean, I suppose it depends on how alarmed you are about these problem gambling rates. And again, going back to the fact this is not problem gambling as we know it in the adult survey. This is a softer definition. But if you really are concerned about it, then the Gambling Commission probably ought to be looking at the National Lottery, because that seems to be where the strongest correlations are. And I'm not suggesting that the National Lottery is necessarily causing problem gambling, but you would expect some curiosity on that point from the Gambling Commission.
So guys, we're at the close of 2024, entering a new year. Dan, do you think we're in a better platform to analyze kind of any statistics about gaming, any of its impacts? And is there kind of a better kind of cohesion between the stakeholders, especially the industry and the regulator?
I think things have actually got a lot worse, and I make this in particular reference to the gambling survey for Great Britain. I think the young people in gambling survey is there's nothing particularly new here. It's sort of as we've seen, things but go up a bit, go down a bit. I think with the gambling survey for Great Britain, the Commission set out with the aim of increasing faith and confidence in statistics. I think they've achieved the polar opposite here. They have published a survey in the knowledge that it is likely to be inaccurate, and not just inaccurate, but they published really quite emotive, sensitive information about issues such as domestic violence and suicide attempts in the knowledge that the statistics are probably inaccurate. In order to believe the gambling survey for Great Britain, I'll sort of summarize it this way. If you believe that that is an accurate survey and it represents a realistic picture of what's going on in gambling in this country, then you have to believe three things. You have to believe that every single official statistic that has preceded it over the course of almost a quarter of a century has been wrong. This is NHS data, it's Gambling Commission data, it's DCMS data. You have to believe everything that has gone before it is wrong. Second, you have to believe the NHS doesn't have a clue about the health of the nation, certainly the mental health of the nation. You have to believe that the NHS has materially understated the mental health of people in England. And then third, you have to believe that the industry data is wrong, because we've been able to take data on actual customers from operators, including one monopoly operator. And we compare that with the estimates of participation from the Gambling Survey for Great Britain, and they're miles apart. So you also have to believe that the industry's own data about its own customers, including one monopoly operator, is wrong. Or you have to believe there's this massive unlicensed market that we didn't know existed and which didn't appear in previous surveys. So I think my concern with the Gambling Survey for Great Britain is that it is so obviously flawed, or at the very least, there are such obvious questions about its reliability. And yet the Gambling Commission's really adopted an attitude of head down, ignore the criticism, plow on, we'll get there in the end. And that unwillingness to face up to what are fairly significant problems, and I would say unarguable problems with the survey, that unwillingness to engage with those concerns is going to do enormous damage to the Gambling Commission, to its relationships with licensees and other stakeholders, and to confidence in official statistics. I think if the Office for Statistics Regulation sort of green lights what the Gambling Commission's done here, then you really have to start to question the whole process of collecting and publishing official statistics.
Dan, thanks so much for joining Steve and I. This has been iGaming Daily.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to today's iGaming Daily podcast, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News network or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.